Hello again to all friends from Bingham Choral Society and welcome to episode 6 of BBC Bingham. It's obviously interesting and useful to look into the background of future repertoire. However, this next year is rather uncertain. We obviously hope that Mansfield will be able to reschedule the Brahms concert, but whether that cuts across our joint concert with Southall or our planned Bernstein-Rutter concert is very uncertain. Therefore, it seems a good idea to look further forward to the repertoire for our November 2021 Jubilee Prom concert. You will remember that the main work you chose was Elgar's The Music Makers. So, this week's BBC Bingham is a programme about Elgar in general and this piece in particular. Elgar was born in 1857 in the village of Broadheath near Worcester. The house of his birth is now part of a museum dedicated to him. There is also a modern museum building just next door. If you've not been, it's worth a visit one day. As someone with a small attention span, I can be easily bored by museums, but the Elgar one is well presented and really interesting. It's close to Worcester and within 20 minutes of Malvern and the Malvern Hills if you want to make a visit out of it. Elgar was the son of a local musician and he learnt piano, violin and later organ as a child. He started composing pieces when he was 10. He initially became a jobbing musician performing and composing for local groups. At this stage, although he had various pieces published and some large-scale choral pieces performed locally, he made little impact nationally. Aged 32, and still really only known locally, Elgar married Alice, 8 years his senior. She became his supporter and quasi-manager for the rest of her life. She was also a writer, and Elgar set many of her poems to music, including the texts for the Bavarian Highland pieces which we did last year. They had one daughter, Carice, in 1890. In their early marriage, they spent a period living in London in order to be close to the centre of music making. However, this was not a successful venture either musically or financially, and they returned to the Worcester area. Indeed, although they were happy together, they never settled anywhere for long. They were always moving to the next house, seeking a contentment and, for Elgar, a professional recognition that eluded them. Elgar lived at 22 different addresses during his life. This touches on something about his character. He was very definitely given to depression. The image of the confident, slightly military-looking character producing music like Land of Hope and Glory is not the real Elgar at all. He was often unhappy and nearly always felt that his music was under-recognised. He continued this feeling throughout his life, even after many of his pieces were national and international successes, and even after being knighted for services to music. Parry and Stanford were the successful musical establishment, and Elgar judged, as we would now say fairly, that he was a better composer than either of them. But Elgar was the outsider. Partly this was some kind of persecution complex, but it's certainly true that his music is much more widely appreciated now than it was in his lifetime. In the 1890s his reputation began to build, but it was not until he was 42 in 1899 that he gained national recognition with the Enigma Variations. Remember that Mozart, Schubert, Chopin and Mendelssohn all died before they were 40. The following year saw the premiere of The Dream of Gerontius. The initial performance of The Dream was very poor, and the work was not well received. Its reputation as one of the great pieces of the choral repertoire came later. The Dream highlights another important aspect of Elgar's character. He was a dedicated Roman Catholic. His other famous full-scale oratorios were also religious, The Kingdom and The Apostles, which were part of what was intended to be a trilogy of works based on the New Testament. Unfortunately, only sketches of the third piece were ever made. Interestingly, although Gerontius is Elgar's most fated piece, some people do not agree with Elgar that it was his best choral work. I agree, for instance, with no less a figure than Sir Adrian Boult in thinking that The Kingdom is a better piece, and Paul Hale would argue for The Apostles. Between 1900 and 1920 came the richest periods of Elgar's composing life, when he was most in his stride. This period included the two oratorios just mentioned, The Music Makers, The Spirit of England, both symphonies, the Pomp and Circumstance marches, and the concertos for violin and cello. In 1920, Alice died, and he withdrew from composing for a while, though George Bernard Shaw, no less, later encouraged him to start working again. During this latter period, Elgar became an early champion of recording, and he made many records of his own works in the late 20s and early 30s, including a famous recording of his violin concerto with the 16-year-old Yehudi Menuhin. He died in 1934, aged 76, still generally feeling that his music had not been fully recognised. Though today he is regarded as the first truly great British composer since Purcell 300 years before. Elgar's output was very varied in mood and depth. There were very many pieces which you would call salon music, lightweight and charming pieces written for the Victorian or Edwardian salon. Much of his output before 1899 was like this, and some small pieces became and remain very famous. The Bavarian Highlands piece we sang is in that style, pleasing, approachable, but light in tone. One of these famous salon pieces is Salut d'amour for violin and piano, which is the first YouTube extract for you to see.